Hello. Very glad to be here. Feel very honored to be a part of the great group of speakers that have gone. I'm really glad Christina went before me because she talked about a lot of things that actually very much relate to data and ways that you can really improve your data and for the whole company, not just the product team, not just the BI team, but really make improvements that really engage the whole company. Yes, good, great. So just a little bit about myself, why I feel that I can speak to data regrets and also best practices for when you're going to be making some data changes. So I have led multiple analytic tool migrations. I have helped with data pipelining, data governance, establishing new data schemas from existing data schemas to establishing a new one from scratch. And then that has led to a few outcomes that, that really enhance the company, anything from hiring the ROI on the spend on data, as well as changing cultures to be more data-driven. And really, my favorite is democratizing the data access and making sure that everyone has access to the data. So let's jump into that a little bit. We're going to talk about the importance of self-serve data. I'll discuss some early risks to having a successful data transition, and then ways to mitigate those risks, and then we'll go into specific use cases, different types of changes to data, and maybe different phases that you might be in if you're making some data transitions. So in just a reason why I chose this topic, I know Google recently announced that they're end-of-lifing their optimized product. I know we just came out of a COVID era where maybe you're changing your data, your business model, and so you're needing to change your data to react to those sorts of changes. So hopefully this can be applicable to many of you. So first up, why is self-serve data important? Why not just dump all your data into a data lake and let your BI team deal with it? That's their job, right? Well, I think the most important thing about why you want to put the data in the hands of the people in your company is that it enables their curiosity and their autonomy. When people are able to ask questions and then get their own answer by themselves without having to involve anyone else, that really is that instant gratification that is rewarding people for asking questions. You want people asking questions, and you want them asking harder questions, more interesting questions, because once they start to really dig into the data, and then they start to get really curious and ask, why is this looking like that, or why don't we have this, that's when your product is really starting to get better. And they start to challenge your product. Also, anomaly detection. So, people that are in the data day in, day out start to have blind spots, and they don't always see where anomalies are. Anomalies don't always look like spikes and valleys. Maybe a plateau is actually an anomaly because you just launched something and you expected that metric to change, but it didn't. Those are the sorts of things that you're hoping your whole team, your whole company is looking at and identifying. Maybe it's a cost savings. Maybe there was an issue and they see a dip or a spike that nobody would have caught otherwise. Or maybe it's actually, more interestingly, a gap in your offering that they're identifying. Those are some big, maybe there's a new revenue, a line of revenue that is sitting in your data right now and you don't know it because nobody's really asking the right questions and taking a look at that data. So hopefully that kind of paints a picture about why you should be very interested in offering self-serve data. Don't limit it to just one team. Everyone should have access to the data so that they can answer their own questions. But before I jump into data-specific risks, I want to talk a little bit about some risks that have nothing to do with data that can really put a data transition at risk. First up, lack of experience. So if you're planning on making a change to your data and the people that are in charge of executing that change have never made a serious change before or a major change before, they're going to make mistakes. It's just a probability. We're all human. We make mistakes. So knowing, having those people, having an expert for those people to go to could be one way to mitigate that, and we'll get to that in a second. Culture and process. So maybe it's kind of regardless of what your existing relationship is with your data today, whether it's a healthy relationship or whether it's a toxic relationship, habits are hard to break. And so that can put a data transition at risk if no one's willing to change their behaviors. And then lastly, a lack of executive alignment. Maybe there's a high cost associated with the change that you're wanting to make. And so, at the executive level, maybe they say they're bought in, like Christina said, they're aligned. But then the change comes, and then they're sort of like reverting back to old ways, kind of challenging what the change was, and even though you've already done the work to make the change. So these are some common early risks that I've seen across different companies that can really put a strain on that transition and really make it a lot more challenging than it really should be. So now I want to get to ways to mitigate these risks. First up, how can you change a person that's never done something before? How can you give them the experience? Well, I like to suggest that every company going through a data transition identify an expert. That doesn't mean that they're an expert already. You want to make them feel enabled to learn, give them the time and space to learn exactly what the change is, know where you were, know what the past was like, and then understand what the future is going to be like. I say temporary expert because you may be thinking to yourself, like, one expert, that seems like a high, single point of failure. Why would you do that? The point is not for that person to be the expert forever, right? As soon as you identify the person that should be the expert in that data change, you also want to make sure that they are working on a plan to democratize that knowledge. The point of having a single person, though, is when you make a data change and people in your company are sort of, have a ton of questions, as they should. You want them to have a single name to be able to reference if they have a question. Obviously, there's documentation, there's Slack channels, or whatever it is that they can go to ask questions or learn on their own. A lot of people might have said that they were a self-starter on their resume, but the fact of the matter is not everyone is. So you kind of want to give them the out to say, you don't know what you have a question, go to that person. That person knows what they're doing, and they will answer your question if the documentation doesn't answer your question. Culture and process. So the thing is habits are hard to break, but new habits are built on the back of existing habits. So one way I recommend to sort of change behavior and build a new habit is to find out where that old habit exists. If you have a healthy relationship and people are regularly going to your tool and going to the data and asking questions, that's great. But if you have a data change, maybe they're not used to pulling a certain metric, right? Maybe it's this new metric and they're used to going to the old one and they don't know where this new one is. Ways to mitigate that are maybe do an in-tool announcement. Maybe work with the vendor that you work with to make an announcement. Or if you don't have that sort of relationship with your vendor, maybe it's like Google, and that would be like an impossible task. Maybe you make a change in a dashboard that makes it really obvious about what exactly the changes are. Or maybe there's a meeting that you have regularly where you cover those dashboards, announce it in that meeting. So just really think about where these habits are happening, and then go to that moment, and that's where you're going to establish your new habit. And then you just got to repeat and rinse. Rinse and repeat. Also, though, if you don't have an existing habit, maybe nobody's going to data, and you're trying to turn your culture into a data-driven culture, you can go to a meeting where questions are asked, but answers aren't always provided. And that's where your moment is to shine and say, like, okay, hey, I heard you had a question. I'm going to go get the answer. Either you're getting the answer in the meeting, or you're going back, you're getting the answers, you're coming back to that same meeting, or maybe scheduling a follow-up. And you're saying, hey, you remember that question you had? I got the answer. Here's the answer. Do we have any other questions? Because data always begets more questions. So you can kind of be the hero in that moment, but also like enable them to start asking questions and start realizing that they can answer their own questions. And then finally, lack of executive alignment. Like I said earlier, the most common barrier with lack of executive alignment that I've seen is cost, whether that's like financial cost or time cost. And the best way to mitigate that is to negotiate. So if it's a vendor and it's a high purchase value, the fear there is that they don't want to make the investment and then not see the ROI on it. So maybe there's a way that you can work with your vendor to have a trial period. So you say, like, for X amount of dollars, much lower cost, we want to be able to use a subset of your features on our data to show what the value is in this product. And hopefully your vendor's willing to do that if their product is good enough. And additionally, other ways you can negotiate, maybe it's time. So then if it's time, can you figure out a little MVP type, reduce the scope of the data changes that you're looking to make so that you can kind of show off what the value is for the change. Okay, so specific use cases. I kind of want to go through like different types of changes and talk about some best practices that I've learned along the way. So first up, switching tools. Either maybe you don't have a tool today, or maybe you are switching to a different analytics tool. You got to ask some discovery questions up front. So first off, you want to be thinking about what are the tool's strengths, what are the tool's weaknesses, and what does my company need today? Maybe some tools' strength is visualizations, but to get more robust or customized queries is not really its strong suit. That might be what you need. Maybe it's visualization that is really going to enable your company, people in your company, to start feeling more comfortable with asking questions and digging into the data. Or maybe the reverse is true. Maybe everyone's asking questions, but they have really complicated questions, so they're not really using your data tools anymore because they don't feel like they're serving their needs. Really think about what it is that your company needs and then pick the right tool for you, because I don't think there's really a one-size-fits-all. There's not like a magic tool out there. And then in addition to that, keep in mind that where you might be in a few years, whether that's 6 months for startups or 3 months, or maybe it's 3 years for larger companies. Where are your needs going to be, not just what are your needs today? Think about like if people aren't asking the questions today, if you start to get them comfortable with asking those questions, how robust will your tool need to be able to be a successful tool that serves your company's needs? Another great best practice is to request customer tutorials. Go to your vendors and say, do you have other customers using your tools that maybe have similar business models as us or have similar challenges as us that we can kind of speak to and ask them, is this going to be the right tool for me? And that can kind of ease that risk up front. Definitely want to gather internal use cases, figure out how people are going to be using the tool, or how they use it today, or how they want to use it in the future, and then assess those tools based on that. Collecting questions from your stakeholders. So this one I really like, because if you go to your stakeholders and you say, like, what questions do you have today that you're not getting answers to, it starts to pique their interest. They're like, oh, well, if I could get the answer to this, that would be great. And a lot of times when they have those questions, they usually think it's like, not impossible, but too hard. It's like, oh, well, if I could get this, I'd be happy. And it's like, okay, well, get ready to be happy. Because there's always a tool out there that will probably be able to meet your need quickly. And then you can always like come back after you've made that change and kind of say like, hey, remember how you said you'd be happy? Well, surprise. Okay, and then lastly, know your metadata. So if you're going to be the one negotiating that contract or working on the pricing model, you definitely want to know what your monthly tracked users are, or your MTUs, what your data volume is, whether that's an event volume or actual storage volume, and then also know what your projections are. How is your data going to grow? Do you anticipate it growing exponentially, or is it just going to be a linear growth? And then finally, bundling options. So, this is kind of like a great one if you're using a tool and you want to tack on a feature that they're offering. Definitely think about that when you're negotiating your contract. Okay, so on from you've kind of assessed your tool, and now you've made a decision on where you want to go, or you've decided on what changes you want to make. So maybe now that you're into schema changes, regardless of whether you're switching tools or not. You want to make a change to the data because you're seeing an opportunity in the new way that you want to track data. The key to schema changes is preparation. So first off, weighing your pros and cons. What are the benefits of making this change? What are the risks, or what are the losses that we are potentially taking on by making these changes? Sometimes I know one time we were talking about, we had just launched a new tool, so data was flowing in the tool nicely, and I saw that there was an inconsistency between one sub-line of business. So there was MapMy was tracking it one way, the MapMy Run was one of the apps that I was working on, and our sister app, MyFitnessPal, was tracking it in a different way. And I saw that we made a mistake, and I was like, oh, this is driving me crazy. We got to go back and we got to change it. we did an assessment, and we said, like, what are the pros and cons of making this change? And we actually decided against making the change. There was that inconsistency moving forward. We figured out how to make it work. Our tool actually made it really easy that we were able to make the change within the tool instead of in the database, instead of in the code. And so it was resolved in the long run, and we never had to take on that risk that we would have taken on initially just to have consistency. So really, this is an important one to really make sure that you're making the right decisions for the right reasons. Identify temporary expert, like I mentioned earlier, definitely immediately work on democratizing that knowledge and helping people understand when the change is coming, what the change is, and who they can go to if they have any questions. And then lastly, of course, make that documentation widely available. So if you're making changes to your taxonomy, talk about the differences and rules between the old and the new. And then differences in principles, like so maybe you're establishing a new principle with your data. Just make sure that those are documented so that you can reference them in the future and people can start to guess as to where their data might be based on the documentation that you've put together. And really, hopefully it becomes more and more intuitive as they see like what exactly those changes are. Okay, so you've done the homework, you've documented all the changes, now you have to make the transition. This one is tough. I'm going to go ahead and be honest right now, this is the most painful part of the process. And the pain is probably going to be inevitable. So there are at least 2 different ways that I've seen be successful at reducing some of that pain. So first up, create 2 separate projects or 2 separate containers. Continue to track the way you used to track or the old way you were tracking, and then track in a new way, and so that you can see that data side by side. This is something that I know I think a lot of engineers kind of shy away from. They don't want to maintain both. And also product managers shy away from. They don't want to spend the time on this. They don't want to spend the effort. It's a cost. It can potentially be costly. But this is one that I think if you do it, if there's an overlap even for just a week or a day or any overlap at all, if you have all of your stakeholders taking a look at that data, which leads me to the second one, get your stakeholders to look into the data and see the differences in that data while you're overlapping. That's a big one to really mitigate mistakes up front instead of having to do a switch over and now you don't have any old data and now you have to make a change and now your data is just wildly inconsistent. It's really hard to get a read on that data during that time period. So definitely recommend double tracking, even for just a short period of time, just so that you can catch any mistakes in scripts or migrations that you've made. Okay, so now adoption. So you've made the change, you got through the painful part, that's great, but now you have the job of getting everyone in your company informed and maybe making some behavioral changes. Okay, so some helpful tools to increase adoption rate. First up, create a getting started dashboard. And I highly recommend including data from all different departments in your company so that you can really get that engagement, to really get that self-serve data widely spread. Get people engaged, show them that what data is available to them and what questions they can be asking, what answers are lying in the data. Encourage them to copy the dashboard, create their own dashboard, play around with the data, manipulate it themselves. But if you have a department or a person or a stakeholder in your company that is really critical to increasing that adoption rate, like maybe it's an executive or someone in leadership, or maybe it's your customer success team. Maybe they are asking a lot of questions and you're realizing that if they could answer some of those questions themselves, they'd actually be great at solving some of your customers' needs right on the call or right on the email or right on the chat. I would recommend going ahead and investing in a specific dashboard just for them so that they can really see how the data applies to them. Because if they're seeing a dashboard full of data that they don't really understand how it relates to them, that's going to be another barrier to them adopting these changes. And then finally, doing a roadshow. So what do I mean by a roadshow? Schedule time with your stakeholders. Make sure that they understand what the new changes are and what the value is in those changes. That's also going to help you with future decision making when there were some risks. Maybe you didn't have alignment and they were worried about the investment. Showing off what the value is in this new change to your stakeholders and to your leadership team is really going to help you, enable you in the future to make different decisions. And then after you're done kind of like going over, showing off your data, showing the new changes and explaining why it's going to be awesome, kind of pick on the people in the audience and say like, did you understand this? What does that chart mean? And if they can't explain it, they weren't listening, because that's usually what happens, or they just don't get it, and that's okay. So you just know, now you know that you need to do some more follow-ups and get in, maybe set up some sessions. Maybe have that expert that you identify a new expert in the room and say, you're gonna be the new expert from now on. And so now the onus is on them to figure out how to democratize that knowledge across your stakeholders. And when you're done, celebrate the work. You're done, congratulate yourself, pat yourself on the back, and then throw a party for the whole company, because I'm hoping your company is way more successful because of it. That's it. Okay, so questions. What is your analytics tool? Atmosphere, we use BigQuery and Looker. We are currently in the process of assessing analytics tools. Not surprising enough, I've been there for 3 months, so this is probably a commonality of mine. In a large enterprise, what are key steps to start democratizing the data with these self-serve platforms and get domains to produce a true data products? Okay, so what are the key steps to start democratizing the data? I would say it's different for every company. It depends on what meetings you're having, what questions you have, like what is your major problem in your company. I would think about like what are the pain points that you're trying to solve with your data change, and then kind of like act as a product manager there and figure out like, okay, well if the problem is that the data is obscure and we need to enable them to be able to run more queries more easily, then like the point is you need to show them how easy it is. Now hopefully you made a change that does actually make it easier to get access to that data, but it's really about showing your company instead of like telling. So I think documentation is important and necessary, and you have to have it and to be able to point to it, but then the next step is to show them how, like what is in that documentation. Yeah.
So when changing schemas, I imagine the question of backfill comes in. Can you talk about like criteria of if to backfill or not to backfill, what to backfill, how far back to backfill from?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what if you're going to change schemas, the question about backfills comes up. How do you make decisions on that? I would say think about how far back you're looking when you're doing your analysis. Is it most important to get month over month? If it's year over year, I know that starts to get really costly. We did a backfill for back to 1 year when I was at a company that looked year over year a lot. And so then we just sort of like maintained 2 tools for a little bit to kind of see like, okay, beyond a year, here's where our data was. And then we have this overlap in the middle, and then we have the data moving forward. So that was a really easy way for us to, we didn't have to increase costs by transitioning storing all of our data in the new tool, but we were able to maintain the storage from our previous years and then only have an overlap of like 1 year's data to be able to compare. Another thing I was thinking about with backfill is also like, don't underestimate like how, I think a lot of times I've been scared to not backfill. And I've had engineers kind of teach me and say like, sometimes you just got to cut the cord and start fresh from somewhere. So it depends on what state your data was in also. If you're making a change because you were finding some inconsistencies in your data, that's a situation where I would definitely just sort of like cut ties, like have it for reference, but don't necessarily need to backfill in the new tool. Any other questions? Awesome, thank you so much.